Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen wassalatu wassalamu ala Sayyidina Muhammadin wa alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in. We are continuing our reading of Allama Iqbal's Reconstruction of Religious Thought in Islam, and we are starting today from page number 6. And during the last 500 years or so, during the last 500 years, religious thought in Islam has been practically stationary. Religious thought in Islam. Now, it's not clear what he means by religious thought in Islam, because by religious thought we can mean fiqh, it can mean usul al-fiqh, it can mean any of the Islamic discipline, it can mean kalam, it can mean usul al-kalam, mantiq, it can mean metaphysics. So it's a huge claim. During the last 500 years, religious thought in Islam has been practically stationary. And what's the significance of stationary here? Stationary. Because the perspective of Allama Iqbal in this book, especially here, is that of modernity. And as we have seen again and again in this chapter so far, he has been heavily influenced by Hegel. And Hegel has been dubbed as the first philosopher, for example, by Habermas, the first philosopher who actually turned modernity into a philosophical problem. And the word stationary is related to a particular conception of history in modernity, especially in Hegelian philosophical discourse on modernity. Motion is very important. The march of history is very important, as we have seen. As we have seen several times before, for Hegel, for example, history is the self-expression of the world spirit, called Geist, and in religious language we call it God. So basically Hegel's God is, or world historical spirit is, all that is there. And either it is expressing itself or realizing itself, but it is realizing itself in time, in movement. So movement is this, and this movement is the historical movement, but it's also a physical movement and spiritual movement and all those. So motion is important, because through motion the world historical spirit either realizing itself or expressing itself, and this motion, this march of history never stops. And different civilizations, different religions, different philosophies are various ways of understanding this self-expression or self-realization. And they are themselves moments in this world historical march. But different civilizations, different philosophies and religion partake in this at different levels or in different degrees. So corresponding to their participation and its value in this historical march, different philosophies and different civilization, different religion get their truth value. So to call a thought stationary is to say that the contribution this thought is making to this world historical march of the world spirit or human history is negligible. So it's a value judgment in a sense. So this stationary thought becomes goes to dustbin of history. It doesn't have any truth value, or if there is, very low, very insignificant. And just apart from Hegelian expression, progress is a general category, very important category of modernity. And progress means material progress as well as spiritual progress, but spirit as seen from the lens of modern philosophies and modern modernity itself. So it is a sign of the truth of an ideology if it contributes to human progress, which is ultimately a material progress, because the spiritual progress is gauged in terms of material progress. So saying that a religious thought is stationary is to say that it is regressive, or at least not progressive, and this in itself is a value judgment on a backwardness of this thought, or the value of this thought for human life within modernity. So to call Islamic thought stationary should be understood in this context. So what Iqbal is saying, that this thought hasn't been catching up with all the progress which Europe has made. He talks about spiritual progress and all that, but ultimately there's no meaning of spirituality without the material progress in terms of modernity. But we'll come to that. So I just wanted to allude to this fact that the significance of the word stationary, that's important. Obviously, in Islamic thought, it has no meaning at all. Stationary is not something good or bad in itself. In fact, stationary is good if you are al-qaim bil-haq. Al-istiqama is stationary in that sense, and it is something very difficult to be firm on your grounds, firm on your ground in the face of the winds of change, in the face of fashions, and changes, etc. So stationary, if it is being firm on what is true, is something good. And motion is good only to the extent it is the motion towards the truth, or to establishing the truth, or to preserving the truth, etc. So motion in itself, or motion just for material progress itself, in itself, it doesn't have any value at all. In fact, if it's not for the betterment and for the good and for the truth and its preservation, it is actually something of a waste of time. if not something, akin to deviation, for example. Okay, so let's go back to the text. In fact, if you look in terms of the tasawwuf and Islamic morality, stations, maqam, and also hal. So it's an important station, is an important spiritual state, and the progress in stations is seen as in terms of a person's perception of truth and acceptance of truth, and standing firm on the truth in the face of all rivalries and adversaries, etc. So the stations are actually, in terms of the tasawwuf, station is a very important concept. Anyway, and the whole progress is gauged in terms of stations, not the other way around. So during the last 500 years, religious thought in Islam has been practically stationary. There was time when Europe, okay. Now, during the last 500 years, religious thought in Islam has been practically stationary. So what's the significance of these 500 years? Because that's when modernity, if it doesn't start, it start rising in Europe, like 15th century. So while Europe is rising in the sense that European imperialism is gaining strength. They are conquering different lands, and then they are looting the resources of those lands, using them to enrich themselves, and which leads to their tremendous material progress, scientific progress, technological progress, and economic progress, as well as an unprecedented hegemony of the Western powers over the world of Islam, the establishment of the unprecedented hegemony of the European powers over the lands of Islam, which is complete by the time Allama Iqbal is writing these lectures or delivering these lectures. So this is a huge event in Islamic history, because Islam started as a minority religion, as a religion of the weak, and then within 100 years it was ruling the bulk of the Asia and Middle East. Obviously Middle East is a European term, but those regions, Africa, Central Asia, part of Europe. And before the Western imperialism, that was one of the greatest empire ever established in human history. So, and after that, Muslim didn't have any general or generalized defeat. There were defeats here and there, but there were conquests as well. But starting from 17th, 18th century, Muslim lands started falling to these imperial powers, and by the 19th century, almost all Muslim lands were under the direct or indirect rules of either Britain or France. And European dominance is with us even to this day, even after the so-called independence and the establishment of almost 50 so-called independent Muslim states. So this is the context. So what I want to say is this was a huge event in Islamic history. The event of the total dominance of imperialism of the Muslim lands, materially, politically, and with the passage of time also spiritually. So it was inevitable that Muslim thinkers would ask them this question, what led to the defeat, and why Europeans are rising, even if they're supposed to be on the false religion. First they were came as Christians, Protestant Christians or Christians of sort, and then they Christianity receded, but Christianity still makes the background, cultural background, and all, to provide the cultural background and all that. So it was inevitable, it was indispensable that Muslim thinkers would ask this question about the causes of Muslim defeat and the causes of the rise of the West. And the answer to those questions would, determine the strategy which Muslim would adopt vis-a-vis this defeat. So, and that's why philosophy of history of sort become very important to all those Islamic thinkers who are trying to understand this transformation. And here Allama Iqbal is working in that set of mind, or with that point of reference. So when he's talking about during the last 500 years religious thought in Islam has been practically stationary, he is developing a sort of philosophy of history which explains the causes of the defeats of Muslim and causes of the conquest of the Western imperialism, and consequently, according to that philosophy of history, it will suggest what is the way out, how Muslim can regain their bygone splendor and all that. And these answers will depend on your point of view or your general philosophical outlook. And generally, we can roughly divide three types of Muslim responses to this question. This question's the question of the defeat, Muslim defeat, and the hegemony of the Western imperialism. And what were its causes? The causes of the defeat, causes of the conquest, and what is to be done. That's the strategy. And in answer to all this, we can sort of categorize Muslim thinkers or Muslim way of thinking in 19th, 20th century, even to this day, into three broad categories. In terms of philosophy of history, Muslim modernist, and that's Allama Iqbal's camp, basically. At least in the Reconstruction, he is a Muslim modernist par excellence. But obviously, Muslim modernism, as we will see, itself divides into many types, at least 2 or 3 types. True. So Allama Iqbal is a Muslim modernist, but with a universalist touch. But Muslim modernism, for example, in India, in the subcontinent, whose founder was or is Sir Syed Ahmad Khan, that wasn't a universalist modernism, because Sir Syed Ahmad Khan conceptualized Muslims as when Sir Syed Ahmad Khan talks about Muslims, he talks about Muslims of the subcontinent. Muslims of the subcontinent. And he said they are a nation separate from Hindus. And that's the first time in Muslim history when when somebody theoretically declared that Muslims were a nation, like Hindus or Jews or British. So they're a group with material interests. And when he talks about Muslims, he talks about Muslims of the subcontinent. So on the other hand, Iqbal, his conception of Muslim is wider. It's a universalist in that sense. Anyway, so there are three responses or three types of Muslim histories which emerge, Muslim philosophy of history which emerges. First is Muslim modernists. And here, this is Iqbal's position, as we will see, at least in... obviously, Iqbal's poetry is much wider, and his poetry is sort of mixture of Muslim modernism and actually Islamic revivalism, plus even Orthodox Islam to a certain extent. Then there's the response of people we can call Islamic revivalists. And in the subcontinents, one of the most important name in this regard is Maulana Maududi. Maulana Maududi is an Orthodox Muslim scholar who, basically is come from the Deobandi school of thought, but with influences from Shah Waliullah as well as other revivalist movement, but who was also hugely influenced by recent movements in the Muslim history in India, for example, Khilafat movement and other jihadi movements. He was influenced by those as well. And then, but he's different from other scholars in the sense that he is exposed to, or he has exposed himself to Western thought, both the liberal tradition as well as the Marxist tradition. Not at a very deep level, but still he knows that the Western hegemony is not just a material hegemony, but this hegemony comes with a spiritual and educational and ideological hegemony. And then there's a third group. So, sorry, I keep going. It's like there's a modernist group, and then revivalist group, and then the Orthodox Muslim scholars. And Orthodox Muslim scholars, some of them didn't even deal with the question. But most of them took this as a normal defeat in a war against Christian enemies. So they took it as a material loss. They didn't try to theorize it as some episode in the world history, and they tried to fight it. And once they saw that they have lost the battle, they tried to defend whatever was left of our religious and social and cultural life. So Orthodox Muslim scholars mostly didn't have any philosophy of history. On the other hand, modernists and revivalists tried to understand the causes of this defeat and the causes of the Western dominance and hegemony. And from those two understanding, they came up with different strategies how to regain Islamic or Muslim power and how to reestablish Islam as a world historical power, a world historical force. So that's the modernist project. Not all modernists, but modernist project as well as revivalist project. But obviously they have two different philosophies of history, but they have this thing in common, that they have philosophies of history. That is, they try to philosophically, or they if you don't want me to use the word philosophy, they try to theorize in terms of history, the causes of Muslim defeat and the causes of the success of Western imperialism. And from those two theorization, they try to come up with a strategy as to how the lost power Islam can be reestablished, and what's the way, etc. So this is the background, and I think we'll stop it here today. And next time we'll look at both Iqbal's theorization, or his philosophy of history, his theoretical understanding of the Muslim defeat and the conquest of the West, and also we'll touch on the revivalists. And only after that we'll be able to understand what comes after. So let's go back to the text. So during the last 500 years, during the last 500 years, religious thought in Islam has been practically stationary. So we'll stop here and we'll, pick it up again next week, and then we'll continue to. There was a time when European thought received inspiration from the world of Islam, because that's the classical Muslim modernist view, and it's very important to understand that, because only then we can, differentiate our response from Muslim modernist response.